I want to actually move into this idea tonight. I just want you to entertain this notion. We're going to be we're in discussing Viktor Frankl's idea of spiritual unconscious. Uh, it might seem surprising that he relies on Heidegger in this section because Heidegger is known as probably the most abstruse, difficult philosopher ever. But they knew each other, and Viktor Frankl makes liberal use of Heidegger. So one important idea in Heidegger that I'll get to is getting us away from the idea that we are a subject looking out at the world. Somehow that I, as the subject, am a stable point of view, as if I'm a lighthouse looking out at the fog, interpreting the world, as opposed to my being in the world is an act of interpretation. I am part of the interpretive circle. I am not somehow independent of the world looking at the world, but I'm in the world being interpreted. And so this idea that the blessing exists inside of it, it's not something that we say, and you'll excuse if that sounds too abstruse, it's something that says us. It's not something that we seek, it's something that seeks us, that the unconscious world is unfolding within us. We don't just watch it unfold, we are part of the unfolding. Now, I know this language sounds almost impossibly abstruse and impenetrable, but as you'll see from this chapter, um, Viktor Frankl's idea of the spiritual unconscious is really it's an idea that I haven't read elsewhere, and I have before Frankl certainly, and I haven't read since. It's a deeply mystical, poetic idea that I think is really helpful for this idea of the spiritual unconscious. So thank you so much, Shanti, for bringing another just wonderful poem. And they're wonderful examples of Frankl's idea of the spiritual unconscious, number one. And number two, when people say to me, what does it mean to go from, in my system, do you start with virtue, rationality, and reasoning to hold interpersonal relationships stable so they don't torment us and distract us from our who we are as a human being? I recommend insight work, managing ego states so we can calm the disruptions of the inner life. Well, once has the, well, I'll call the virtue world regulated and the inner life regulated, all of that is preparation for a life of depth, which means I see them as important in and of themselves, but also making possible a life of depth. So as you know, when people say, well, what do I mean by life of depth? I say, well, one core element is the study of poetry, because poetry bypasses the conscious, rational mind and moves into what I might call the meta rational mind, or the mind the consciousness that exists most closely to the soul. And poetry therefore calls the soul forth. You can't read good poetry with the rational mind, although we do need to decode the words. Poetry, like music and other art, speaks directly to the soul. So this is the reading of poetry is quite nice, but it's also essential, meaning it is a key part of who we are and how we understand the religious life. All right, so we're studying a text. So in a way, I'm treating Frankl's um, book, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, like studying the Bible, which means I want to read sections to you and discuss them. The book is available on Kindle, and I have a Kindle edition in front of me. So let me bring you up to date. The first chapter of this book is Frankl um, advocating against any kind of reductionist understanding the human being, especially Freudian reductionism, that the human being is some kind of a machine, some kind of mechanism where there are powerful, uncontrollable forces lying underneath the surface. We would call that in German, it's just called the S, by the way. When Freud wrote in German, he spoke of the S, meaning the it, that thing over there, which in Greek is id. Freud spoke of the ich, the I, which people who translated Freud from German chose the word ego to mystify it. And Freud used the term Über-Ich, the above I, to describe forces that are repressing the primal instinctive drives of the id. So Freud just called it, I, and the above I. But when it came over into English, people mystified it with this Greek terminology. Now, an important thing to remember when you discuss Freud, the Über-Ich, the above I, is not the higher self, but the oppressive self, meaning is the things we develop in order to push down the primal instinctive drives of the wild part of us that is primarily expressed from Freud's point of view in sex, violence, desire, etc. The, the force of repression comes in and creates what Freud would call the epiphenomenon of culture. And that's a very important idea to understand. So I want to spend a few moments on that. You've probably heard things like sublimate desire. To sublimate means to take something primal and refine it into something culturally acceptable. But Freud sees culture as inherently repressive. Instead of allowing to be, as it were, in touch with these primal desires, these primal drives, it gets channeled into cultural endeavors. For example, from Freud's point of view, unlike somewhat like Marx, uh, religion is an illusion. It connects us to something that doesn't exist. The moral life basically is repression. He does not believe there is a God. He thinks that morality, in ways, is a system of repression, just as Marx would see it as a system of oppression. And so, what's a cathedral? A cathedral is a place where you go. Primal drives have been made into beauty, which is a kind of a sublimation. And one engages in devotional work, including the reading of great poetry, which ultimately represses our primal instincts. Uh, of course, Frankl would be diametrically opposed to this idea that religion is, you might call the taking of primal drives and turning them into culturally acceptable modes of existence, as opposed to an authentic spiritual drive that finds expression in poetry and music and the study of sacred poetry. So he starts out really, and he does not end, because remember, as Frankl's writing this, Freud has his ascendancy, and even much of psychotherapy today is based on a Freudian model, meaning things that have happened that we repress, trauma, mostly by parents in our undefended young years. This creates symptoms. So therefore, the human being is basically an array of symptoms. And whenever you feel bad, it's because your, as it were, primal self has been pushed down. So the oppression creates symptoms. And when you go to therapy and you realize, well, it's all about my mother and it's all about my father and about the trauma that I had. I don't mean to diminish trauma, but trauma does not create who we are. I mean, it's not a one-to-one relationship. My trauma creates who I am. Trauma happens to us. It can certainly deeply pain us, but it is not the essential part of our being. So as you talk in therapy, you unrepress, so consciousness goes up, therefore symptoms go down. So kind of a hydraulic model. And that's one reason, by the way, I think in those kinds of therapy that are only directed toward understanding our childhood and our trauma as a way of reducing symptoms, I actually think in some ways can scar a human being, um, because they're given a view of the human being that is so limiting that you think that's who you are. You are a system of repression of trauma, talk therapy, release of trauma, and therefore symptoms go down. And many people have gone to therapy for years and they just don't feel better. They don't understand why it's not working. Well, just keep going, keep coming back. It's going to work better. And then of course you have, I would say, the more enlightened kind of therapy. Elaine, I'm looking right at you, which is I'm not here to tweak the mechanism. I'm here to help you engage in a life of meaning. All right. So that being said, in this chapter, Frankl is directly attacking the idea of the unconscious as the place of buried trauma. So Frankl says that it is true that instincts lie in the unconscious and we are driven. So if you've ever seen yourself make a mistake, do something you knew wasn't right, do something you don't understand. Yeah, we're profoundly the results of unconscious psychological drives. That's absolutely true. Falling in love, falling out of love. These are not rational decisions. Something is driving us from within. So, yes, there are unconscious drives. And the idea of psychotherapy seems to be will make the unconscious conscious. So, the distinctions between the unconscious and the conscious. Frankl says the most important distinction is not between the unconscious and the conscious, but rather what he'll call instinctive drives versus spiritual drives. When he comes over to spiritual drives, he says spiritual drives necessarily reside in the unconscious. You cannot make spiritual drives ultimately conscious because that's not the nature of spiritual drives. So let me read a little bit to you from chapter 2 of Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Um, So he says logotherapy centered on the spiritual, which constitutes the noological. So you've seen this word N-O-O, the logical. N-O-O or N-O-U-S is the Greek word for spirit. So noological means the spiritual dimension as opposed to opposing to the psychological dimension, but he means that kind of mechanistic psychology that many people thought was the only way to relieve distress, the only way to relieve ourselves of symptoms was this mechanistic psychology, and therefore he's using what we might call just spiritual psychology, which is the name of what I used to teach for years until I changed it to wisdom work. I'll talk about that maybe more tonight. And then his redefining of depth psychology. Depth psychology used to mean going into the depths of the unconscious to uncover things that were very hard to get at. Jung, for example, would look at repressed things from a mythological perspective, but he says focusing on the spiritual depth, which is overtly spiritual and of religious concern. And we have to redefine religion here as well. So he's bringing us into this idea of the spiritual unconscious, um, as opposed to the the instinctive drives that Freud talked about. There are other drives that are spiritual drives. And from Frankl's perspective, you might be suffering because you have instinctive drives that are not being fulfilled. And when our drives are not fulfilled, of course we suffer. He says, but you might even be suffering more because your spiritual drives are not fulfilled. This is a really important thing to think about. I just want you to imagine. Here you are suffering. I think of myself back in high school before I met my teacher, Jack Bishop. There I am, maybe a particularly sensitive and thoughtful 16-year-old kid, not understanding all the chaos going on within me. And then I find a teacher that says, the, the essence of my being is a spiritual self trying to assert itself in the craziness of Southern California life in the 1970s. Now, once my teacher made me aware um, that my, as it were, the unconscious God, using Frankl's terms, was seeking out, and I was living in a life in a way that was mangling my spiritual and moral sensibilities instead of providing channels for spiritual existence to come forth. Right? He may have saved me from a lot more chaos than I was already creating. In fact, it drove me into the military because I wanted a stable life so that my spirit could flourish. Now, it sounds odd when people say, I joined the Marines out of a spiritual concern. I wanted a stable day-to-day life. I didn't want a lot of choices. I didn't want to ask what I'm doing tonight. I don't want to ask myself what I'm going to wear today, right? I wanted to wear my uniform. I want to have my life completely prescribed so that I could spend time on my spiritual life. And that's the beauty of the ashram or the monastery or the for me the toughest military unit I could find, because I didn't want freedom of choice in my day-to-day world so that I could recover freedom of choice in my spiritual world. I have language for understanding myself more than now that I've been studying Frankl. So he says here, um, existence is essentially unconscious because the foundation of existence cannot be fully reflected upon and cannot be fully aware of itself. So the goal here is not to make the unconscious conscious, but to realize there is a spiritual unconscious that cannot be fully understood, but rather we can, as it were, revere it. We can help birth it, right? So in the birthing of spiritual consciousness, we relieve the symptoms that are there because we're not living authentically spiritual lives. I want to give you one maybe controlling metaphor for tonight before I go on. It's a counseling experience that I had of a person who came in, and a person that I knew kind of quasi socially. I saw the person at the edges of my teaching and social circle, and he was really suffering. Things were getting very bad with his family, with his wife and children, and he came to me and presented himself. He says, "Look, I'm," he says, "I'm 60s. I've already made the money. My kids don't like me. My wife likes me even less. I'm basically spending my time, with cocaine and porn and other things I don't feel like talking about." And he said, like most guys my age. I said, that's not what I know, but if that's what you want to think, go fine. And he basically said, there's empty. There's something more. And so I detected a bit of a soul there. And this was a person that when I got his story, yeah, there had been profound disappointment, betrayal by adults in his life as he was trying to express his spiritual sentiments. He got pushed into the narrow consciousness he's a big guy, so a big frat boy, business and ethics, and kind of a hail fellow, join the party, very social kind of a guy. That's how I saw him. I can't say I particularly liked him, because I could see the superficiality. And he said, it's an artifice. I made that up. I don't know what else to do. And so uh, I understood because I've been working a drug and rehab program for so long, and I could see what addicts talk about, the God-sized hole in a person's heart. The most superficial understanding of Judaism imaginable, in many ways, a caricature of the way that many Jews talk about religion and religious practice and the devotional practice. And he had gone to therapy, and he really understood, how his parents and aunts and uncles had mangled him. All his interest in spirit was Norishkeit, the kind of the deviations from a real life, which is making money and you got to have a big house and succeed in business. And nobody there ever to encourage his spiritual life. And my job, in a way, as I wrote in my email, was to introduce to him a new vocabulary: honor, reverence, devotion, beauty, truth. As opposed to the way that he was instinctively solving his life, which was to criticize, to bully, to manage, to control, um, and engage in a life of depth. So in any case, I've had so many people like him that were suffering, and yes, they got enough therapy to understand who mangled them, but that didn't address the God-sized hole in his heart that can only actually be filled with something like the life of spirit. So he was conscious of what happened to him as a young person, and it sounded valid. I mean, I got it, but that it wasn't, as it were, true. So here's something that I'll share with you. When I went through Hasidic spiritual psychological counseling with my Rebbe, Yonatan Omerman, he was in the school of the Kotzker Rebbe, and the school of the Kotzker Rebbe was, to to comb the skin off the students, with a hot razor. I mean, just if you said one wrong thing, man, it was like he dug in there. And one of a big focus of the Kotzker Rebbe was the world of motivations. Where we don't understand our motivations, we're false to others, we're false to ourselves, and to dig and strip away motivations. It had a very Freudian dimension to it, meaning to strip away the motivations to see where the primal motivations are, And one thing I learned from Jonathan, he says there are 15 different motivations for everything that you do. So it's not as if you get to the bottom, you've gotten to the real motivations. We live a life of layered motivations, and the spiritual motivations to know God essentially stay mysterious and unconscious because they can't be defined into language. So what Frankl says, he says the essential problem is not bringing drives to consciousness, but to live with the spiritual unconscious, because as I indicated earlier, that's where poetry is understood. That's where the soul is experienced. So by definition, it's unconscious, but the main thing is to allow the unconscious to flow before us. Now, so I just want us to each take a moment looking at ourselves. Um, Try to imagine that since you've been a young person, you've had spiritual drives within you, and you may not have known how to um, listen to these drives, how to nourish the spiritual self. So we go into a variety of other things to reduce our suffering, but not understanding from a Hasidic perspective that you have a starved soul trapped inside of you that was looking to be nourished and understood and expressed, and in many ways, mainly through religion. The problem is that, as you know, I think Judah has been terribly taught and practiced. When I went to synagogue here, I see myself as you probably see yourselves too, here as a young spiritual guy, go to services and open the prayer book, and remember responsive readings. The rabbi reads the Roman print, we read the italics. Oh Lord, thou art great. Yes, greatness is thou, oh Lord, back and forth, back and forth. A little bit of cantor music. The rabbi gives a sermon, and we all go home. I mean, there was nothing spiritually edifying about that whatsoever. In fact, services only became spiritually edifying for me was when my Hebrew became fluent. And so the beauty of the Hebrew prayer book, I went to Orthodox services where they left me alone. Like the cantor's like a metronome. I could find my own little private space, go deeply into the prayer book, and not be, as we're interrupted by responsive readings, and just be having a private experience in a public place, and being in a public place where there's an array of people all having their own private experiences, but with the same text, as it were, at least ideally, is that we're all using a common text for our own personal searches, but in a common space. That was our ideal of our devotional experience at the when we had a building and could gather. All right, so that's very important. The unconscious is where the spiritual lies. Essentially, it's unconscious. Um, um, so a little bit further in the chapter, again, I'm in chapter 2 of man's man's search for ultimate meaning, which for him is spirituality. The real criterion of authentically human existence derives from discerning whether a given phenomenon is spiritual or instinctual. Yes, there are instinctive drives, but there are also spiritual drives, not conscious or unconscious. He says, is it part of the instinctive drives or is it spiritual drives? He says what you want to regain is, and here's where he goes a deeply philosophic mode. He says being human is not um, is not being driven, but by deciding what's going to drive you. So a person says, I'm a function of my drives. He says, no, you're a decision on what drives you. So he quotes Karl Jaspers. It's called the Entscheiden. Entscheiden is German for to decide. The Entscheidenes sign, the deciding being, and that's something I've profound for me. I'm not sure where I learned it, but when people say, "Why am I as I am?" You might remember my I have a quip of an answer. Why am I as I am? People say to me, "Well, genetics, um, experience in early childhood when you were in the world and not able to interpret the world. There's a strong emphasis on all ages from infancy into about 4 or 5 years old. Everything since, every single thing since then has been taken in. So our genetics, our early childhood, everything since. And then the fourth thing was our history of decisions, conscious and unconscious. You are who you are because you've decided what you're going to be tomorrow, mostly unconsciously. So look at all the choices you've made in life. how many of them were made from really thinking well and also paying attention to the life of spirit? Many people are driven by choices that have been, as it were, decisions foisted upon them, made in the unconscious realm, and sometimes in unconscious drives. You look back in life, you say to yourself, what was I thinking? Sometimes we weren't thinking. And then I would say to people, so it's your genetics, your early childhood, everything since, and your history of decisions, conscious and unconscious, and mainly the decision of what you want to be tomorrow. All of that does not predict who you will be. It sets the stage for your ultimate decision, which is what will you be tomorrow? That's the decision that you make today. The most important part of our lives in Frankl here is the deciding self, and then he mentions Heidegger's Dasein. So I want to talk about that bit because he really, really has great regard for Heidegger. The Hebrew word Dasein, da means there, sign means being. So yes, it does mean being there, but that's just the Hebrew word. The German word for existence, meaning your being is somewhere. Your being is in the world. Um, so this idea of being there, that we exist in the world, shapes the idea that I talked about before. It's not that I'm separate from the world, interpreting the world. I'm in the world that I'm trying to interpret. And therefore, the greatest act of interpretation that I need to do is interpreting myself. So part of what Heidegger was proposing, again, it's not a full course on Heidegger, but I want you to have respect for this incredibly abstruse and difficult theologian. I think he was a theologian as well as philosopher, is placing the self at the core of reflection and not seeing the self as a function of the past, but rather as a function of the present and future. I'm not who I am because of what happened to me. I am who I am because of what I'm deciding to be tomorrow. Just to put it in one quip. I am who I am because of what I'm deciding to be tomorrow. Now, the I am who I am because of what happened to me, Heidegger and Frankl calls facticity. It's one of these, kind of a simple word fact made into a big word. Facticity is the facts of your existence. I had this kind of a mother, and this kind of a father, and this kind of bad luck, and this kind of good luck, and this happened to me, and that happened to me, and here I am. That's called facticity. Facts make me who I am. So he says, authentic existence is present where a self is deciding for itself. You don't say I'm a function of the facts, but the facts are, as it were, a layer, and inside that layer is an essential self deciding, for a life of meaning, hence logotherapy, and and being engaged in the world from this perspective in a responsible, accountable way, mostly driven to a life of love. Why a life of love? Okay, it's lonely here. Okay, this is a the scabrous journey of life. Life sometimes is not kind. And one thing I noticed since I was a young rabbi is we make it more difficult to each other. We're all trying to get our way. When we're all trying to figure this thing out. Someone gets in our way, we criticize them, we alienate, we say words that break covenantal bonds because we don't see ourselves as existentially living lives of ultimately concern for others. So this is an interesting kind of paradox. The fulfilled self is a self that serves in love other people. And people say to me, yeah, but my wife, my husband, my kids, my parents, they're so horrible. I said, well, maybe they're lonely. Maybe life has mangled them. Maybe no one has ever been present to them. And, you might call the, reasoning love. It says, look, I love you. You can't, you ought not insult me. If you do, I'll walk away. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm a fully present human being. I love you to be that as well. I love you to join me in this thing. But I'm not taking these back alleys of criticism and conflict as a way to work out a relationship. This is one thing why I focus on virtue, rationality, and reasoning to hold down our civic, dignified, honorable humanity as our starting point, and from there learn how to love and be with each other, as opposed to living lives that are frustrated and we can't get our needs met and we're mad at other people. And this whole thing just becomes a sorry experience of not living with I'll call it kind of a spiritual responsibility for ourselves and living responsibly with other people. Um, let's go. Um, I discussed the facticity and so forth. Ah, here we go. Um, so he's talking about his ideal psychotherapist. Remember that psyche means soul and therapy means to heal. So when you think of psychotherapy, think of healing of the soul, a soul healer. Um, so his ideal soul healer is concerned with spiritual existence in terms of freedom and responsibility, and therefore marshaling it against psychophysical facticity. So this is a really interesting idea. Let me unpack that. Psychophysical facticity is I'm a function of the facts in my life. And the job of the psychotherapist, the soul healer, is to say, no, you are not. You're not who you are because of what happened to you. Right? It happened. That's the facticity. It's a you live inside these layers. However, the job of the soul healer is to help you recover freedom and responsibility. I'm ultimately responsible for living a life of spiritual integrity. That's your main concern. That's your main meaning. I believe that to be true, and that's the point that Frankl seems to be meaning here. Um, he also there's two philosophers he mentions over and over again in this chapter, and one is Max Scheler, Scheler. You'll see his name when you come to the book. Um, um, so this is apparently from Shaler. Every person does have a psychophysical overlay, even though your existence is ultimately spiritual, meaning you are a spirit living in an overlay of facts. You're a spirit living in an overlay of facts. The facts don't determine you. Your existential choice uh, uh, determines you. He says, after all, I am not really justified in saying myself, since I do not have a self. Oh, we don't mean that when we say myself, but just think for a minute. I over here don't have a self over here, but rather I might have facts about my life, but the self is a constantly evolving phenomenon. And I thought about this many years. It's such a mystery to take a step back and breathe and try to imagine that there's a becoming self, and this moment of consciousness is part of the becoming self. So we both observe the becoming self and re-enter the becoming self, and we observe the becoming self and we re-enter the becoming self. But the main thing is to be experienced, to experience one's own radical individuality, which means radical responsibility. There's a being formed in the depths of your soul. Um, he follows by being centered around the existential, personal, spiritual core. Being human is not only individualized but also integrated. The spiritual core, and only the spiritual core, warrants and constitutes oneness and wholeness in the human being. The integration of the somatic, psychic, and spiritual aspects. It's not possible to overstate the threefold wholeness that makes a human being. Um, let's see. Uh, the self does not yield to total self-reflection. Human existence is basically unreflectable, basically, and so is the self in itself. Human existence exists in action rather than reflection. You can only reflect to a point, and the next thing is, what will I do now? So, Mirav and I were having a talk about this several weeks ago, and I said, uh, you are by what you do. And so, as we were coming out the end of this time off, the first time off we've had in our entire professional lives after ILS, we just stopped working. We went on strike. So we had long coffee and we watched movies and read books. And I said, I think I'm a Netflix consumer at my core. I just, and a Kindle consumer, just like no plans, nothing to do, nothing to be, just play, just play. We took long walks and 3 hours at the gym and 2 hours at the beach and you say, well, I got to do. No, we don't got to do nothing. What we got to do is nothing. We've never done nothing in our entire lives. Unfortunately, during my doing nothing, I hurt my back terribly, which put a kind of a crimp in my play. By the way, it's gotten so severe I actually can't walk, so I'm having surgery on Wednesday. So this coming Wednesday, keep me in your prayers for a great surgeon and speedy recovery, and we'll let everybody know how it goes. Um, um, anyway, just on that, like I'm suffering terribly. I can't walk. Everything I do is suffering. People say, "But you look great." I said, "I feel terrific. I just can't walk." I was like, wow. And the pain is unbearable, but I feel great. But you know why? I'm studying Viktor Frankl. I'm studying the soul. I mean, when you study I can't walk, but at least when I'm not walking, I'm studying Viktor Frankl and reading Psalms and studying Talmud and studying Zohar. It's like my soul is joyous. Here in Israel and so there's this kind of the physical pain, but it only reaches so far because my soul is flourishing. I feel like I'm a living example of what I'm teaching here. Um, let's see. So here he says, to sum up, spiritual phenomena may be unconscious or conscious. The spiritual basis of human existence, however, is ultimately unconscious. Thus, the center of the human person in his very depth is unconscious. In its origin, the human being is unconscious spirit. He quotes something from the Vedas: that which does the seeing cannot be seen. That which does the hearing cannot be heard. That which does the thinking cannot be thought. I don't completely agree with that, but ultimately, as the soul goes through the world, it's unconscious, and then we can look at what like the results of my spirit coming to the world, and I can observe and I can reflect and figure things out. What poems do I like? What poems do to me? What happens when I read from Psalms? Why do I gravitate to one verse over another verse? So I'm in conversation with the being of spirit, but from my perspective, um, if some part of your day, meaning not just thoughts, but in your calendar, studying poetry, making time for the poetry. For me, I'm back studying Zohar with a wonderful teacher. I'm back studying Talmud with a wonderful teacher. So I put these things in my calendar so that parts of my soul that might be unexpressed are brought in. So that's what I want to say to all of you is you have to spend time in contemplation. You have to spend time reading poetry. You have to spend time in the devotional life, which is not for me theological, but ultimately uh, uh, a world of experience. Another way of saying is I don't believe in God as much as I experience God. I don't need to. This is the big mistake of theology, as you know. When I look at the atheistic critique of religion, it's as if all we do is sit around and talk about theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? That's not that's never been a part of religion. People say to me, if you believe in God, yes, I believe in God. Is God all powerful? Not really, but go ahead. I see the question coming. Well, if God's all powerful and good, why do innocent people suffer? I don't know. Do you know? Well, I know that there's no God. I said, thank you. Is there anything else you want to talk about? We can finish that in exactly 1 minute. You got anything more to say on that issue? No. Okay, so get a life, look at your soul, be accountable. You tell me how you experience your death and leave me alone. So this whole idea of the, religion versus non-religion, I think it's actually kind of a silly, useless conversation. What are we talking about here? You want to tell me I don't have a soul? You don't have a soul. I'm happy the fact that I have a soul. You don't find religion helpful? Don't be religious. I just ignore the theological problem and I get along with the business of using religion to cultivate my inner life. So if anybody says, but how could this and how could that? Say, I don't care. I don't care. I'm sad. I'm sad that good people suffer. I'm really sad about it. This conversation is not going to help. If you are really concerned with suffering people, don't waste your time being mad at religion because you're not going to help anybody with that. In fact, you're probably hurting yourself. So go out and help some suffering people instead of taking all that anger out on people who, for reasons maybe that they don't understand, love being religious. Um, okay. Um, last couple of words. Um, okay, I think I got most of it out. Now maybe I have something from Psalms I want to read to you, and then I'll see if there anybody else has a word from Psalms they want to interpret or any questions about any of this. Um, this is a Psalm 30 in the traditional prayer book is said every day between Birkot HaShachar, the early morning blessings, and Pesukei de Zimra. There's a lot of discussion of how it got there, but there it is. So I'll read a few verses from Psalm 30 tonight. Um, a psalm of inauguration of the temple by David. So here it goes. Aromimcha Adonai ki dilitani. A dili is a bucket, and dilitani is God, as it were, went down into the depths of your soul and drew you up. Okay, God drew me up out of my dark depths. Um, Goes forward and says, verse 3. Adonai He'elita min Sheol nafshi. You've brought my soul up from Sheol, from the dark regions. Chiatani mi Divor. You revived me from my descent into the pit. Zamru ladonai hasidav. May those devoted to God sing to God. Vahodu lezecher kodsho, and acknowledge or celebrate in the mindfulness of God's holiness. But I want to mention something here, something that I read and I quit when people say to me, um, why do we have all these prayers praising God? People say, what, God has such a fragile ego that God needs to these prayers? And I thought, there it is, another, you know, superficial critique of religion. And had young kids. I said, why do I tell my children I love them 100 times a day? Somebody say, Daddy, we know you already told us like all morning and all afternoon. I said, I'm not saying it for you. I'm saying it for me. I need to talk about it, how much I love you and I'm crazy about you. And I said, so on one hand, it's not as if I believe that this God that has, as it were, a lack, because we're not saying, oh yeah, you are really good. That's not what it feels like. What it feels like is that there's some mystery that we want to sing toward. Then a Hasidic quip is, God loves it when we sing to God. So trust me, God is lonely on the high and heavenly throne, and God says, "Would you guys sing to me? I just, it's lonely up here. Yeah, sure, I'll sing to you. Just the idea that God said, one hand, I need to sing to the mystery. I would have never thought about that. My too cool for school high school self, sing to the mystery, and then or this Hasidic idea that God is lonely and wants us to sing to God. I love these ideas. It's really, really powerful for me. Um, uh, so sing to God, O devout ones. Give thanks to God's holy name. Um, and then verse 12. I love reading this whenever I've gone through tough times. It says, Hafachta mispedi lemacholi. A hesped is a eulogy. You've turned my eulogy into a dance. Pitachta saki. You've heard of like dust and ashes. So you've opened up that sackcloth that I wear. You just said, take it off. Get rid of that sackcloth. Straighten up, be normal. Um, Vita'azreni simcha, and you've put happiness around me like a garland of flowers. Isn't that an amazing verse? You transformed my eulogy, my lament into dancing. You took my sackcloth off of me, and you've adorned me with happiness, so that my soul might sing to you and not be stilled. It says, "Lema'am yizamercha chavod v'lo yidom." My soul, my uh, uh, um, I will sing to the glory and not be silent. Adonai Elohai Lo'olam Odeka. Lord my God, I will be eternally thankful. So try to imagine there, this, melancholic, depressive side, and learning how to daven. I read this. I went, wow, kind of imagine there's some spiritual force that can say, take that sackcloth off, put these flowers on, um, and quit eulogizing yourself and start dancing. Yeah, it's a great idea. Thank you. Love you, Bible. Anyway, uh, that's my teaching for tonight. Um, any questions, comments, or thoughts about any of that?